Welcome. Time to talk TBI. Say that 5 times fast. Welcome everybody, my name's Stephen, I'll be your MC for this evening. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands in which we meet tonight, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, whose sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. I'd further like to acknowledge the complex relationship that First Nations people have with brain injury in sport. We know that Indigenous Australians are almost twice as likely to sustain a TBI than non-Indigenous Australians. We further know that Indigenous Australians are statistically overrepresented in our nation's elite sporting codes. So, a fairly simple extrapolation of that data would indicate that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are at a higher risk of sport concussion and its long-term consequences. And despite this, we have only in the last 2 to 3 years begun studying sports-related concussion in Indigenous populations in earnest. More needs to be done. On behalf of the Queensland Brain Institute and the Queensland Brain Injury Collaborative, I'd like to welcome everybody to Heads Up. Hosted by the University of Queensland, the Queensland Brain Injury Collaborative, or QBIC, is a network of researchers, healthcare professionals, people with lived experience, and advocates who work together to learn more about how and why people sustain brain injuries, what happens to their brains during these injuries, and how best to treat them when they occur. QBIC's remit covers brain injuries that occur in any setting, but our purpose here tonight is to investigate arguably the most contentious and newsworthy manifestation of brain trauma, those which occur in sport. My name's Stephen Townsend, and I'm a historian at the University of Queensland. The team at QBI have graciously, perhaps foolishly, given me a few minutes at the top of proceedings to speak about some of my research, and it will hopefully become a little bit clearer soon why a historian of all people is hosting a panel discussion about concussion and neuroscience. Before that, however, I'd like first to introduce the stars of our evening, our panellists. Can I ask that you give each of our panellists a welcoming round of applause after I introduce them? Dr. Fatima Nasrallah, to my right, is an Associate Professor of Neuroscience at the Queensland Brain Institute, where she leads the Nasrallah Concussion Lab. Fatima is a world leader in developing new technologies for diagnosing brain injury using MRI and biomarker technologies. And she brings to the panel a look behind the curtain at the cutting-edge research that goes on to help clinicians diagnose and treat concussions. Welcome, Fatima. Speaking of clinicians, to my left is Dr. Gary Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is the physician for the Australian men's rugby team, the Wallabies, and an emergency physician at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. Gary is boots on the ground, using the best scientific evidence to diagnose and treat concussions on the field and in the emergency room. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight, Gary. For those of you who follow rugby league, our next panellist will be immediately familiar. Trevor, the Axe Skillmeister, had a 15-year professional career throughout the 80s and 90s, playing for Penrith, Brisbane, Northern Suburbs, Eastern Suburbs, and South Queensland Crushers. Trevor, you covered almost every point on the compass. Surprised you didn't ask for a game with West Tigers just to round it out.
No, thanks.
Trevor played 22 State of Origin games for Queensland and was capped 3 times for the Australian team. However, he offers us tonight more than a player's perspective. He's also the founder of Gillies Tackling Academy, which teaches young footballers how to stay safe in the high-impact world of football. Thank you for being with us, Trevor. Cheers. Rounding out the panel to my far left is Professor Warwick Bowen, a quantum physicist. Warwick is director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence in Quantum Biotechnology, another tongue twister, which also bears the acronym of QBIC. Just to avoid confusion tonight, I will refer to the Queensland Brain Injury Collaborative as QBIC and Warwick Centre as the National Quantum Biotechnology Centre, but please just note that there are 2 QBICs in the room tonight. Such is Warwick's brilliance that last year over coffee he managed to explain quantum physics to me in the time it took me to drink a latte. I've lost it all now. But for one brief shining moment I was able to understand the movie Ant-Man. Warwick's lab is leading the nation on implementing innovative quantum technologies in multiple settings, including healthcare. He's the chief investigator on a project that is developing quantum-powered MRI helmet that, if successful, will be able to provide immediate sideline diagnoses of concussions. Warwick, we're all excited to hear about the possibilities for this new technology. Thank you for being here. Folks, you can see on the screen behind me a QR code. We have plenty of time for questions at the end. However, if you would like to ask a question at any time throughout the presentation, please scan the code on your phone and press the Slido window. A Q&A screen will then pop up. Simply type in your question, add your first name if you want to, and click send to submit your question. It will pop up here in front of us, and our friendly operators are ready and willing to take your call. Okay, so we know why our panelists are here, but why are you here? Some of you are here because you have a personal connection with concussion. Perhaps you're concerned about risks of brain trauma for your children or your students who play contact sport, or even yourself. Others are here because you're interested in the science, or perhaps the policy environment around concussion. Some of you are here for the canapes. There is also a very select group of people in the room from my department who are here for the rare side of me seeing a button-up shirt and a jacket. Whatever our diverse reasons for being in the room tonight, it is a universal and inescapable fact that concussion is a sporting conundrum that grips us in ways that few others do. Here in Australia, we appear to be in the throes of a crisis, a concussion crisis. Fears that were previously a private sporting trouble whispered between coaches and athletes have entered the public domain. Characterised by surge in media coverage, rule changes, the foundation of sporting brain banks, class action lawsuits, calls for TBI research, and public discourse like we're engaging in tonight. All of this appears to have emerged in the last 20 years. However, the narrative of a sudden concussion crisis is a myth. But like most myths, there is a kernel of truth to this. The last 2 decades certainly have seen a surge in public interest about sports concussion, and the genesis of these rising concerns aligns closely with the 2003 diagnosis of chronic traumatic encephalopathy in the brain of Mike Webster, a former professional footballer in the United States of America. And this is a really alluring narrative because it provides us with a neat origin story for our current state of affairs. But I never trust a neat origin story. The reality is that the concussion crisis of the 21st century is one peak in public interest, embedded within a historical cycle of concern about sporting brain trauma that in Australia has lasted for at least 150 years. Globally, knowledge about traumatic brain injury stretches back much further. There are descriptions of TBI in the Edwin Smith Papyrus from the Egyptian Second Intermediate period, roughly 1600 years BCE. The Hippocratic Corpus of 5th century BCE Greece, the writing of Celsus and Galen in the 2nd century, the Persian scholar Rhases in the 5th century. In the late 19th century, traumatic encephalopathy was proposed as a consequence of repetitive brain trauma. In 1928, Dr. Harrison Martland published the first study of boxers with punch-drunk syndrome, which we now call CTE. Closer to home, the Medical Journal of Australia first listed traumatic encephalopathy as a sequela of repetitive head trauma in sport as early as 1936. I've somewhat condensed and conflated some of these important terms here, but the key point is that concussion has been described in medical literature for roughly 4,000 years, and dementias have been an acknowledged consequence of brain trauma for at least 100 years. But hang on. Australians have been playing modern contact sport like football since the mid-19th century. How is it possible then that we did not care about concussion in sport until the early 2000s? The short answer is that we did. Historians in the US have discovered that the first concussion crisis occurred in US college football at the turn of the 20th century, and this actually gave rise to the National Collegiate Amateur Athletic Association, or the NCAA, which most of us are probably familiar with. My own efforts have revealed earlier concussion crises in Australia, including a period of heightened concern at the turn of the 20th century that coalesced around the 1901 death of boxer Otto Cribb. There are also sites of concern in horse racing and in football throughout the first decades of the 20th century. And I argued that Australia then underwent its own early concussion crisis in the 1930s, which led to major reforms in boxing. For the sake of time, I've glossed over some details, but if you're interested, I have a new book out. Thank you to the QBI for facilitating this shameless plug and cash grab. Details aside, if we can take any lesson from history, and I'm increasingly sceptical about our collective ability to do so, it might be this. Although the current concussion crisis may appear to be new, in reality, tonight's discussion and the seemingly ubiquitous debate about brain trauma in sport is part of a long historical process. And I do challenge the characterisation of this discourse as a crisis. I cannot ignore the fact that the current period of debate and interest is unique in terms of its breadth and intensity. Although these so-called crises have happened before, they cannot happen again. If you don't want your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren listening to someone like me in 100 years' time speaking about the missed opportunities of the 21st century concussion crisis, please listen to the brilliant people beside me. Question them. Take this information back to your own sporting clubs, your own organisations, schools, homes, or the polling booth, and help us advocate for research and policies that make sport safer for everyone's brains. Thank you for indulging me. Now, to the main event. Trevor. Australians have been getting hit in the head whilst playing contact sports like rugby for around 150 years. But it is clear in the past 2 decades there's been an upsurge in concern about brain trauma in sport. You've been a player, a coach, an analyst at the highest levels of rugby league for more than 4 decades. Can you tell us a little bit about attitudes towards concussion in your coaching and playing days, and perhaps how it's different to the current climate?
Early days, it probably was not frowned upon, but it was kind of people didn't recognise it as such. So I mean, I got the old people used to, and older people will know the old magic sponge that used to fix broken ribs and everything apparently. So, but yeah, you get the sponge on your head, and you'll be right. Way you go. You know what I mean? So, and obviously we've come a long way since then, but I think people didn't know about it as much those days, so there's no excuse nowadays. But I think the best thing that I've seen as well, like the game nowadays, is a lot safer. It's if anything, and this has not been negative, but it's probably gone to the other side, which is a good thing. So a lot of the I think when I was a child, I think back when I was driving in that I probably had more injuries and head knocks when I was a kid than I did when I was a senior. Probably still growing into your body and being small, I think you're probably susceptible to it a little bit more. So your technique needs to be better, when you're tackling and things like that. So so my father taught me how to tackle, and my brother in the backyard, and there were some good Barneys there too, I can tell you. But I think the best way to get around all this type of stuff is to teach proper technique and making sure they're practicing all those techniques all the time. So getting your head out of the way, getting your feet in the right, I won't get into too technical, but getting your feet in the right position and things like that. And I remember, and I was with the Australian side. We were in New Zealand playing over there, 2020, and I'm showing some of these first graders, tackling procedures and techniques and stuff, and they're saying to me, "Oh, no one's ever showed me that before." Well, dead set blew me away. You know what I mean? So there's a lot more to do with clubs. They need to recognise, safe tackling techniques for sure, no doubt about it.
I want to ask you more about safe tackling techniques and specifically about Gillies Tackling Academy in a minute, but let's break the seal on the audience questions. Trevor, did you ever experience pressure to play on after a head knock?
No, I don't think so. I think it was my own pressure. I wanted to get back out there, and that's the beauty about the safe techniques nowadays, that they take it out of your control. The players' control now, that they got no say, which is a good thing. So yeah, but us poor feds those days, we I'm right, I'll go out and away you go. You know what I mean? So I didn't have any pressure from coaching staff or anything to go on.
Yeah, and that internalised pressure makes a lot of sense.
Oh, exactly.
Athletes want to be on the field, right?
Exactly right. Yeah.
What was your prompt for founding Gillies Tackling Academy? I mean, we've heard a little bit about proper technique.
Well, I was getting phone calls from friends and friends of friends and relatives, and can you teach my son or my daughter or my nephew or grandson some tackling tips and stuff like that, and I went, because I was doing couple of week, and then all of a sudden it was a floodgate of it, of phone calls, and all of a sudden I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. So I got in contact with a few mates in Madison and people like that in those areas, and they were keen to help me, and my old club Norse let us use the fields any time I want to, so that was really good. But yeah, it's just, to me it makes sense to be able to teach these kids from the start. So we have 7s to 12-year-olds, and then we have 13s to 17s. So the 13s to 17s, we have a 2-day camp. So It's, 2.5 hours, but I have a psychologist and a dietitian come in and speak to them as well. So I encourage the parents to come in most of the time, especially about the diet. But yeah, so it's been really receptive. I couldn't believe the feedback we've got from the families. We've had people come from Roma, Toowoomba, Central Queensland to bring their kids down, and I'm thinking there's a void here somewhere about tackling techniques and getting them to tackle safely.
Thanks, Trevor. Gary, before we go any further, I think it's important that we clarify exactly the type of injury that we're talking about here. So sport can produce many different types of brain trauma or traumatic brain injuries at varying different levels of severity. But the one we hear about most in sport is concussion. As the panel's resident doctor, can you explain to us what a concussion is and what happens to the brain during a concussion and what are some of the consequences of this injury?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Might give some of my background before I get into that to say how as an Irishman sitting up here on this panel and working with the Wallabies. But so I played through the Ulster and Irish setup back home, went to medical school, and then moved out here to do a couple of junior doctor years after working in the NHS and not a great healthcare system to be part of. So and after spending a year out here playing and working as a junior orthopaedic resident at the time, I decided I was going to stay and did my specialist training. After playing a few years with UQ at the Red Heavies, we're actually playing against brothers one day, and one of my teammates got a big laceration on his head, needed 20 odd stitches, and there was no doctor at the ground, so I stitched him up after the game, and ever since then I've worked my way through club rugby and into professional rugby in the last sort of 14, 15 years. So I've been brothers team doctor for the last 8, 9 years. I've worked through the Reds under 20s, NRC, the amateur, and been with Super Rugby with the Fiji Drua and the Queensland Reds, and then the Fiji national team in the 23 World Cup, and since then with the Wallabies in the last few years. So I'm a rugby man at heart, and rugby union, I'll refer to as proper term, and I want to make the game safer and better. My other job is work as an emergency physician at the Royal Brisbane Emergency and Trauma Centre, so we see both sporting and non-sporting related concussions. I want to make it safer for the 6th grader playing on a Friday night versus Joseph Suolese playing in front of 100,000 at the MCG. We've got to have processes and pathways and diagnostics with it. So going back to your question, yes, there's mild, moderate and severe traumatic brain injury. Mild is often used interchangeably with concussion. And what happens, there's a transient loss in neurological function after a direct or an indirect blow to the head. So you don't need to take a shoulder to the head, a knee to the head, fall off a horse and hit your head. It can be an indirect blow, such as a whiplash or rotational forces as well. During that time, if you've had that direct or indirect blow, there's this neurometabolic cascade released in your brain, and lots of ions are released, and you can get some swelling and reduced cerebral blood flow, and that actually adds up to some of the symptoms that we would see, disturbances to noise and to light, as the ion channel is firing and unhappy. You might feel foggy or slowed down due to the reduced cerebral blood flow going to your brain. And some of that can persist for minutes because it's transient, and some can persist for days and even for months. We know roughly 90% will get better in that first 10 days, but there is some that persist. Our job as doctors at the side of the pitch and in education, and education is the main centerfold in dealing with concussion at the minute, is recognising the short, medium and long-term impacts of it. In the short term, there's a thing called second impact syndrome, which has been written about and a concern. So that's really recognising that someone has had a concussion and removing them from a field of play to reduce a chance of having a second impact, which may cause rapid swelling of the brain, which is concerning. In the sort of moderate time frames, there's actually risks of other injuries and risks of getting a second concussion if you're not fully recovered, and having that, again, education point to the players and the athletes to say, you're at risk of your ACL or another injury if you're slowed down, you're feeling foggy, and your balance and vestibular system's not working well. And then long term, the concern is of CTE, with more and more research coming out showing the causal link between repetitive concussions and CTE. And we really need to focus a lot more time, money and effort into that, such as the studies that we're doing with QBI and the TACKLE study, but also larger longitudinal studies, and the NINDS recent stuff in 2022 is really pushing for that long-term longitudinal studies.
I think what's really important, and everything you've said is very important, but I think one thing that really stuck out to me is that you don't necessarily need to have that amnesia or a loss of consciousness for it to be a concussion. So diagnosis can be tricky, right?
Yeah, actually, in rugby we use a criteria 1 and criteria 2 terms. And criteria 1, it's actually pretty easy for me to diagnose concussion. That would be someone having tonic posturing, ataxia, balance problems as they stand up. That stuff's easy. It's the vague, it's the criteria 2 stuff. There's a below threshold impact, a possible and maybe impact, possible ataxia, possible dizziness, possible vagueness. And in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, there's been this huge push to educate the players, the staff that we've heard about, so everyone can recognise this and make the less subjective aspect of the testing.
And I'd like to bring Trevor in here again, because sometimes these diagnoses actually rely upon the players themselves to self-report their symptoms.
Yeah.
Do you think players in your era and now have a fear of or a reluctance to admit those symptoms?
Oh, my day they wouldn't have said too much about it, but now they're spoken to about it, and the history that can be involved down the track as well. So I think, and being a lot, not just a player, like being able to run the water and all that type of stuff as well, and you get to know your players, and the physios are on the field nowadays, which is a good thing. So they can tell straight away, and I could even tell. I'm not a doctor, anyway, but I could tell because I know the players. I train with them every day. I do everything with it, so I could tell when a player's, staring in space, or just had that blank look on their face. You know what I mean? So I go, mate, you're getting off. You know what I mean? And some of them will argue with you. And I would have done the same thing. The old days. And but no, you're getting off. So I think it's really a good thing that they recognise and all that, and the players are a bit more accepting of it, as well. So which is good.
So there's been a bit of a cultural shift.
Yeah,
that you've
100%
seen.
there is. Yeah.
And I think one of the cultural shifts that we've seen is potentially around the language around concussion or mild traumatic brain injury. And I'd like to bring both Gary and Fatima in here as well. So in modern professional sport, we hear a lot of medical terminology that's sort of permeating the commentary. Anterior cruciate ligament, compound fracture. But we still hear concussion far more frequently than we hear mild traumatic brain injury in the commentary or just in casual conversation around this injury. Do you think it's useful for us to use the clinical term, or does concussion still have a use in these conversations? I'll ask Gary first.
Yeah, no, we certainly, I will tell the players you've had a brain injury and that you need to let your brain rest and recover to make it get better. And we do use those terms now. Previous concussion was, probably a bit more the grey unknown, whereas, you've got a brain injury, that's more of a hard diagnosis, and I think players can actually relate to that a lot more. And it's bringing them along on this journey so they can take some ownership as well with that. And yes, we're always there to try and protect them, but at some point they have to be honest and report.
Fatima?
Oh, look, I think they've been used interchangeably. I do worry that the term concussion does underestimate the severity of that injury. So, for example, when you've had a concussion, it might not be as evident that you've had a traumatic brain injury like what we see when patients come into the ICU, for example, or you've had a severe brain injury. It hits you quite hard that injury, you've suffered something that's quite impactful. When you've had that concussion, you can get off the field even though you're feeling dizzy. It's very invisible what's happening inside the brain and how long it lasts for. And so I do think people try to move away from that sort of mild brain injury term and really focus it on the concussion, underestimating that person might not need to go to hospital because they're okay. There is sort of a culture that has to change there because they are the same thing and they refer to the same thing. They refer to the fact that your brain has been injured. There is a consequence of chemical factors that are taking place in the brain, and that will take time to come back to normal. And if it doesn't come back to normal, then obviously there's an issue, with the longer term consequences that we see in the complex. So, yeah, I think that there has to be a culture change from that adolescent phase, really.
Without a doubt, though, if you say to me as an ex-player, concussion, I go, yeah, okay, no dramas. But you say brain injury, it's a bit of a different scenario.
Yeah, you're not going to go running the next
Yeah.
day with an ACL injury, but you might
Yeah.
go to work the
Yeah.
next day with a concussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fatima, we know the state of play. Trevor's given us his perspectives on changing attitudes and changing culture. Gary's helped us better understand what a concussion actually is. Can you take us into the lab? Can you tell us about some of the recent developments in neuroscience and how that's changed the way that we understand concussion, and particularly where your research and the tackle study fits into this agenda?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've talked about the invisible nature of concussion. Your brain gets an impact. It's not severe enough to rush you off to hospital. And so there are lots of secondary effects that are happening in the brain. It's a dynamic condition. It's not an impact that happens and it stops and you're okay. It's an evolving dynamic change in the brain that needs to be followed up, and it's quite minor. So I think there's global efforts looking at trying to understand what's happening in the brain from a physiological perspective. So there's biomarker research looking into bloods to see how the physiology in the brain can be measured through biomarker. There's helmets that are, that have sensors that are looking at, how can we sense the effects that are happening post the concussion or the impact. There's a lot of global research, MRI scans, there's mouth guards. I think what we've been trying to do is really take that to the next level in terms of identifying, you do a diabetes test, you take a finger prick and you know that you've got, diabetes, and you know how to control that now because you can determine that there is a problem. And what we're trying to do with this tackle study, and we're starting it from the adolescents, not only because we want to raise awareness around concussion and the impacts of that and bring that down to the adolescent level, we also want to follow those up for longitudinal studies and really determine whether there are links with longer term issues. So what we are doing is looking at a gold standard. MRI scans tell you exactly what's happening in the brain. You can take an MRI scan and say, there is an issue. Does that fit with the biomarker and the physiological changes that you see when you take a blood sample? And how you can take this to the field. We want to look at early predictors of outcome. We want to know that, if you take a finger prick on the sideline, you are definitely going to have, complex concussion syndrome 4 weeks down the track. And you want to avoid that by taking the proper management and taking the proper gradual return to play to be able to enforce those changes very early on. And this is what the tackle study is exactly doing. We're collaborating with the GPS schools around Queensland, not particularly targeted to GPS, but they have a very high profile for rugby. They're into their game. Students are very much, it's life or death for them, really. And we follow up these students outside of season. They get a baseline scan, an MRI, they get a blood test. They also get saliva, they get a finger prick test. We've got, good stakeholders and partnerships that allow us to do that. And then during season, once they've had a concussion, we follow them up to 21 days, continuously taking blood samples and MRIs. It's a bit of a rigorous, and a lot of work for parents and the families to do that. But we think it's very important to really identify and have some robust data around, when do they need to be followed up? How do we recover from a brain injury and how long it takes the brain to recover? And if you've collected that dynamic data over time, you'll be able to make that information possible. If you've only looked at a snapshot once you've come off the field, it's not going to tell you what's going to happen down the track. You need that continuous change over time to be able to say, yes, this person has recovered because this is how severe the injury was, collecting the HIA. So this is I think, I'm probably biased here, but I think it's a great study because it allows us, it's in partnership with World Rugby, it's in partnership with QScan around Queensland, which allows us to collect data across Queensland. People can go wherever there is a QScan clinic. It's in partnership with Gary Shepherd, which is, state-of-the-art blood collections. So I think it puts us in a position where we can answer some really good questions rather than the studies which say pre and post season, yeah, there is a change, what do we do about that? So we're sort of trying to take that precision medicine approach.
And this is clearly research that's been a long time coming, and we've heard about biomarker technology as a potential silver bullet for concussion for quite some time. How far off are we from having an effective biomarker test for concussion, do you think?
Quite a bit far, I think. Look, we're nearly there. I think Abbott put out a blood test recently. I think the issue is the diagnosis of the severity of those concussions. So Abbott put out the blood test, which basically tells you that, you don't need a CT. I mean, there's a huge amount of CTs. If you get a concussion on the field, you go into the hospital, pretty much, you have to have a CT to see whether you've got any internal bleed or so. Their blood test is fantastic in a way that it tells you that GFAP or USLH1 can tell you whether you need the CT or not. You don't have a contusion, you don't have a hemorrhage. So that's good, but I do think that the longer term effects of those are not really studied. We don't have biomarkers that are telling us about those, people who at 4 weeks post-concussion, they've got complex concussion syndrome, which means that they need to go through rehabilitation, and sometimes it's months post-concussion. We don't know how to diagnose early those who really need acute care. And I think we're at that stage. I think there's a lot of biomarkers out there. NFL is another biomarker, but sometimes the physiology, how do you match that to what's happening in the brain?
And Gary, I'd like to bring you in here as well. So what are some of the most important recent developments in neuroscience that inform your practice and that you believe are really valuable in pushing this science forward?
Yeah, Fatima and I have been on multiple research projects in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Currently, we don't have that golden bullet yet to objectively diagnose concussion. We still rely a lot on the SCAT, the concussion assessment tool, which is the international consensus release, and then each sport usually has a modified version of that, which you can do at the pitch side. You rely a lot on the player giving objective symptoms as well, subjective symptoms, and then you can, such as the modified balance test, delayed recall that you'll do. If someone comes to my hospital with chest pain, they get blood tests, see if they're having a heart attack. They come with issues with their kidneys. We check a blood test, see if they've got a kidney injury. We don't have those tests yet for the brain. It's still an area that we're trying to understand more and have blood tests that Fatima talked about, the recent ones with Abbott. They're great in terms of they're sensitive to rule out a bleed, but they're not specific. So you could come in and actually end up having a higher chance of getting CTs as well. So we're not there yet.
Sure. Speaking of potential silver bullets, Warwick. So clearly knowing when someone has a concussion is important, but as we've heard from both Fatima and Trevor and Gary, diagnosis is tricky and often involves multiple different forms of diagnostic tools. You argue that quantum technology might provide some solutions for us. Can you first give me the idiot's guide to quantum tech, and then tell us about the device that your centre's developing, the MRI concussion helmet?
Yeah, sure, very happy to do that. You might ask, why is a quantum guy on this panel? And hopefully I can answer that question.
I would never ask that.
For you. So yeah, what do? I basically build gadgets based on quantum mechanics, right? What does that mean? Well, quantum mechanics is the theory that describes stuff at really small scale. It was discovered 100 years ago, almost today, and it led to a revolution in technology. So semiconductors that you use to build computers, lasers that we use to power the internet, GPS on your phone, all of these things came out of an understanding of quantum mechanics, as did really powerful medical technologies like MRI that we heard about. And also a technology called magnetic encephalography, MEG, which I'll tell you a bit more about later. What's very exciting is in the last 20 years or so, we've learned how to control quantum behavior of small things much, much better than we used to be able to, and that's driving a whole new range of applications. You might have heard that the Queensland state government and the federal government are putting $1 billion into bringing a quantum computing company here to Brisbane, which aims to produce the world's first useful quantum computer. Quantum technologies are also used in sensing and imaging. They allow you to see stuff that you couldn't otherwise see and detect things that you couldn't otherwise detect. You've heard from a bunch of people on the panel about how concussion diagnostics are generally qualitative clinical diagnostics rather than quantitative diagnostics like you would have for diabetes or heart disease. So the question we asked in the ARC Centre of Excellence in Quantum Biotechnology is, how could you use quantum sensors to diagnose concussion? And it turns out there's a very natural way to think about this, and that is, concussion is, now I'm not a concussion expert, so take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt, but concussion is a functional disease rather than so much a structural disease. So it's hard to assess how severe your concussion is by looking at structure on something like a CT scan. What you'd really like to do is be able to detect your thoughts. And what are thoughts? Well, thoughts are currents, are currents of electrons in your brain. That's what controls your thoughts. So you'd like to be able to detect those currents. And it turns out there's one technology we have that allows you to do that. It's called MEG, or magnetic encephalography. That's this image up here to the left. So if you could detect those currents in your brain, then it's been shown that you can tell between someone who has concussion and someone who doesn't. And the hope then is that you could not only more accurately determine the severity of their concussion and therefore treat them appropriately, but also watch as they improve over time and give them appropriate care. And beyond that, you could understand better how different treatments like drugs, anti-inflammatory drugs, or new treatments assist in addressing concussion, in treating patients rather than just treating their symptoms. So, what's the problem? Sounds like everything's solved. Well, there's only one clinical MEG machine in Australia. It's in Melbourne. So, how many people on a sports field or in a workplace can realistically fly to that machine and get a diagnostic and then fly back to it every week to see how they're progressing? You can't really do it. So you need to go from these highly sophisticated machines in one location, 100 in the world, to something that can be in clinics around Brisbane, could go out into other communities, and could go into sports fields. And that's really what we're trying to do in, I was going to say Cubic, in the National Quantum Biotechnology Centre, and in collaboration with Cubic.
The two cubic.
Yeah.
Cubic cube.
Yeah,
Cubic
both
squared.
in cubic, cubed, squared. I can't do maths. Right. So what's the challenge? Well, the challenge is that these electrons that move around in your brain and generate currents, the only thing that comes out of your brain about those currents, from deep in the brain at least, is a very, very faint magnetic field. That magnetic field is far, far fainter than the magnetic field of the Earth, for example. So this is why you end up needing these extremely sophisticated facilities with very, very expensive sensors. We're trying to change that equation using new quantum sensors that we have developed here in Queensland, and also other sensors that other people have developed around the world that allow you to detect those magnetic fields at the right precision. And our first prototype, this is a ChatGPT created image, but will look something like a Ned Kelly helmet. It's not going to be very pleasant for people to wear, but it'll be a lot more pleasant than flying to Melbourne. And why do you need that stuff? You need that stuff because you need to shield the field from the Earth in order to precisely measure the field of your brain. And then we hope over time, and it will be a substantial amount of time, that very heavy and uncomfortable helmet, as the technology gets better, could be translated into something more like a cap, as you see on the right of the screen there.
Warwick, we've got a question from the audience.
Oh.
How close are we to putting the helmet on someone in real life?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's always hard to predict with research. In some sense, you're not doing research if you know all the answers, right? But we have a timeline. We aim to be doing that in about a year's time. So we're currently developing, we've got the sensors in the lab, we're designing the helmet, we're starting to make our first measurements in the lab, and the aim is to roll out onto the sports field in collaboration with Fatima and her team at QBI, and measuring rugby players before the game, after a knock, within a year.
Trevor, correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a little trepidation in the idea of a helmet that can detect your thoughts after a game?
If you lost, you would be. There'd be a lot of thoughts going through there, but you're too smart, you are, which is fantastic. So yeah, but to be able to do that on the sideline or something like that would be magnificent if you could do it. Yeah.
Soon be seeing Ned Kelly helmets on
Yeah.
park footy
Well,
ovals
the
all
headgear.
over the country.
I mean, the headgear is be gold if you could be able to do.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, it'd be
That-
outstanding, wouldn't it?
If you ask me how long that's going to take,
Yeah,
I'll give
yeah,
you a much
yeah.
less certain answer.
Yeah.
And Warwick, so this technology is obviously really exciting. It's been around for quite a while, but we've obviously seen an explosion in terms of the level of sophistication and its applications. What are some other applications, particularly in the healthcare setting, for the type of work that you and the ARC Centre of Excellence for Quantum Biotechnology?
Yeah, well, our centre, we established the centre because we recognised that there were a lot of applications in health and med and pharma, particularly for quantum tech, and that was an underserved area. What examples can I give you? Well, if you could get this cap working, currently, what do we use MEG systems for? We primarily use them to diagnose and treat epilepsy. So if you have epilepsy, then the rolled gold treatment for it, if you need surgery, is to fly to Melbourne, get your brain imaged with MEG to identify where the problem is so that the surgeon can take out the right part of the brain and not the wrong part of the brain, right? But you have to fly to Melbourne for that, to this one machine. Now you could start to do epilepsy treatment in clinics all around Australia, just like with MRI, you can get access all around Australia. And if it's as portable as the devices we're developing, then take them into rural and remote communities that don't have good med tech for healthcare. Beyond medical imaging of the brain, these computers, like the one I mentioned that's being built here in Brisbane, have the potential to allow us to understand how molecules move better. Now, why would you care about that? If you understand how molecules move and interact, you can design drugs. Currently, if you want to design a drug, it takes 10 to 20 years and costs billions of dollars because you guess 10,000 drugs and you get one right. If you could pick them better, you could drop the cost and you could have more effective drugs. So we're working on designing, on applying quantum computing to design drugs. And if you can understand molecules, you can also understand the molecular origins of diseases like dementia. So dementia, it's known that it has something to do with misfolding of proteins in your brain, and they end up becoming these aggregates, and those aggregates are damaging. But it's not really known how that happens. If you can understand that, then you can start to treat dementia better. And in diagnostics, if you have a mole and you're being tested for a skin cancer, then you might have a little sample taken and get that screened. There are quantum technologies that allow you to more precisely screen for that sort of disease. So we may see them coming into cancer diagnostics as well.
Thanks, Warwick. I think I understand quantum physics again. Maybe for the next 5 minutes at least.
We need to scan your brain now.
You don't want to know what's happening in there right now.
You're better than me.
Fatima, in addition to your research with athletes, you also work with other groups who sustain brain trauma, so military personnel, motor accident victims. What are some of the similarities, differences you see in terms of brain trauma, frequency, intensity between those groups? And I'd like to bring in one of the questions that we've got on the panel here, particularly around subconcussive impacts and the repetitiveness of the trauma that we see in those different settings. Can you talk us through some of the different populations that you work with, and perhaps why sport's unique and significant?
So the majority of my work is really in more catastrophic, moderate to severe injury. We run a big trial which looks at brain injury and diagnostics and prediction of outcome for moderate to severe brain injury. I think some of the similarities, and you're talking here across the spectrum, but it's all brain injury really, is that dynamic evolution of brain injury once you've had it, whether it's mild or very at the, subconcussive range where we actually can't see it and can't see the symptoms, or whether it's the moderate to severe, right? It's a change in time. When you're in the ICU, you have to monitor the patient for days before you can really, make a proper, clear decision. And this is better ICU consultants than I can talk about, but this is just my experience with the research we do. And I believe it's the same thing with subconcussive injuries. Any injury to the brain, just like when you get an injury to your arm, it's going to cause a bit of a bruise, right? And that will take time to go away because it will trigger some reactions. And so, across the board, I think the basic biology is really there. The significance of the impact. In repetitive injury, I think it's a bit more of an issue because, if you've got a severe injury, you have a severe injury. The MRI tells you, the symptoms tell you, you can see it. If you've got a very mild injury like what we see in sports and concussion, you can't see it. So it's the first thing, the players don't want to believe it. You're telling them that there are issues, but if they're not feeling bad and they're not feeling unwell, then there is nothing wrong. And I think this is where the issue is with the repetitive nature of sports, or in the military. I think it's very similar because this is what we're seeing in the military studies that we're doing and the veterans, that you have this repetitive nature. You get an impact, there's a cascade that's triggered, and Gary explained that quite nicely in the start. And if you get another one before that's sort of recovered, that sort of accumulates over time. So there's this cumulative effect that will never go back to normal if it's not left to recover. And this is where I think the conception of, the longer term consequences of brain injury and why the focus has been on sports, although this can happen in instances of, domestic violence or firing of military, where if it is repetitive enough to be cumulative, then that longer term delay in that recovery is going to be there for a long time. And unless we understand how that recovery takes place and we can measure it, and we don't have sensitive ways of measuring when the brain comes back to normal, you are going to always run that risk of having those longer term issues. So, and the subconcussion, I think, is an interesting one, and this is just my understanding or my belief in that, you've had the concussion, you've told them to go off the field, they're off the field for 19 days for a very, very arbitrary number. We don't know why they've come up with 19 days. It might be 6 days for all I know, So you've told them to come off the field, they might have not recovered by 19 days. You're getting them back on the field, but they have a minor injury that's, has not been flagged as a concussion. So they keep on playing and they keep on getting these head knocks that affect that initial impact that was there. And that cumulative nature is still there. So which means that you're still looking at longer term consequences because the original injury hasn't recovered or the original impact. So I think this is where, the importance of understanding and being aware that when you've had an injury or an impact, what the consequences of that is we don't know. So being on the cautious side is probably what you need to do, what clubs are doing at the moment with that 19-day rule or the moving to the 21-day. But I still think there's not enough research going to this, let alone the funding from government to support really facilitating that diagnostic pathway so that, you can avoid the those who don't need CTs and don't need to go to hospital, and you can really focus on those who need that acute attention to be able to minimise those longer term issues.
Yeah, this leads really nicely to my next question for Gary. So athletes will often do anything to stay in the game. We've heard that from Trevor as well, even if that potentially means risking their brain health. As a physician, both in the emergency room and on the field, what are some of the challenges that you face around, firstly, making diagnoses, but then secondly, the treatment and rehabilitation phase with these athletes as well?
Yeah, every diagnosis can be challenging, brain being one of the major ones, like we talked about the why around that. We're taking massive steps in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of the education part, bringing the players along with this. They've got to be able to feel comfortable to report, and there's many times I'll be walking a player down the tunnel at Suncorp Stadium before I've even done the head injury assessment. I'll have said to them, be honest with me, have you any symptoms? And they'll tell me yes or no. I'd say in about half the case before they even got into the room to do
and
that.
Just before we go on as well, because we've got a question on here about the HIA. What is the HIA assessment? And it's obviously different in different jurisdictions, but what's the head injury assessment that you use?
So at the professional level, the HIA is the head impact assessment. It's based on the SCAT assessment, which is from the International Consensus in Concussion. And it's subjective and objective testing that we do on players at baseline in the pre-season arena. And then if there's been a confirmed or possible concussion, they'll then undertake this test at a couple of time points, either during the game, post-game, and days afterwards to see if they're recovering from it. So yeah, going back to the question, it's difficult to diagnose, and education's a big part of it. And also the players have got to have some sort of ownership to this. They've got to be some sort of, throwing the shoulders into your opposition's head, and we've even seen that recently in the British and Irish Lions tour, how bad that is. There's got to be some sort of ownership around that. We've got the blue card, which the referees can use at junior levels and at club levels, where there mightn't be medics on the sideline to say that they've actually seen something they're concerned of and can flag it. And then there's lots of initiatives that we see, say every month or two. Fatima and I were chatting about this. We get approached by some sort of company that may have some sort of test that may help with our diagnosis. Currently, the instrumented mouth guards that we're using in professional rugby union is showing a lot of benefit as a test to say that someone may have had a concussion or an impact that has set off forces that they should be removed at least for an assessment. So that's become a real benefit with that. There's a retired players program for the brain health aspect within World Rugby. So every retired professional player now is getting screened from neurocognitive assessments as well. But a large part of this has got to come down to the players understanding it, coaches understanding it, and prevention is better than a cure. So the more we can get that education out to coaches and players and to everyone involved in sport, the less likelihood you're going to have these sort of impacts.
And look, it would be wonderful to have someone like you on the sideline for every park footy game all across the country every weekend, but clearly that's not feasible. What are some of the unique challenges that we see in community sport, and do you have any advice for people who either work in or volunteer in community sport around recognising and diagnosing concussions?
My other half would say I probably am at most games. That a couple of months ago, I was at Reds on a Friday night, Brothers on a Saturday, and the women's on a Sunday working. So I always get told to wind it in a bit. But yes, there's the biggest advice I would be is again education. So every coach, manager, and player have got to read and understand what a concussion is, how to diagnose it, how to recognise it, when to remove be able to remove someone from at risk of getting another impact or further issues and getting them off the pitch. And in rugby union, there's a lot of very clear guidelines around that. So it's got to come around to the education piece. Rugby Australia have a concussion manager who should be present at every game, whether that's your coach, whether it's a physio, whether it's a medic. So at the grassroots level, there should be someone. I work in a trauma centre, and it's one of the questions is, would you let your kids play sport? And I know I thought I would answer this along with it. And when I let my kid drive a car, if there's speed limits, there wear seatbelt, there's airbags, and there's regulations to stop people driving to make it safer. Sure, and that's what do tests. You learn about it. And same with rugby and contact sports. Is there procedures and policies and safeguards around the sport to help weigh the benefits of why we play the sport, why we love it, and the good aspects? Yes, I would let my kids play sport, but I would want to make sure that they're going onto that field knowing that the referee's educated, the coach educated. There's no one going to be looking to do cheap shots at them, and there's actually policies and processes around it.
Yeah, look, this is a question I was going to ask at the end, but I mean, we've brought it up now, so let's address it now. Trevor, would you let your kids play rugby?
Oh, without a doubt. Like my dad worked on that theory that the more tired my brother and I were, the less trouble we were, and less trouble we get into, as well. So, especially young boys, especially when I notice with the academy we do, the young boys, 13, 14, 15, mate, they've got that testosterone going. That's and that's an outlet for them. You know what I mean? So you can only punch a boxing bag so many times without getting cranky and stuff like that. As you know what I mean? And my brother and I were 13 months apart. So every day it was on. You know what I mean? So we best mates and all that type of thing. But that's the testosterone. Mum used to just shake her head and walk off. You know what I mean? But it was we're boys it's great to see all the women now, playing all AFL, Union League. They have been for quite a while now. So it's just not only the men to get their outlet out of contact sports. I think it's a terrific thing, and as we just said, as long as they're taught properly, and you got to remember too, there's some poor coaches get tossed the job. They played little park footy or something like that, and they get tossed the job. For the juniors, I'm talking, and so they're just doing their best. A lot of the time. So the more coaches that have got to put that time in and try and help the kids along the way as well. And there's going to be, and kids are all growing. What about the size of them nowadays? Like, so some kids are, 13 and they're only small, and the other kids are, very tall and big, and we're a lot of Samoans and Tongans and stuff playing the, footy now as well. So they're big bills, So they need to be taught how to tackle properly. But yeah, mate, I let kids play all the time, and it's got to be, they got to want to play it. Shouldn't be pushing your kids to play it. So, my mother, she drove us around all weekend, playing sport. Myself and my brother, and I think it was a great thing for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that has been a shift in that you're, particularly as a young man, you are less railroaded into playing those high contact sports. Now there are more options. Yeah. So Fatima, would you let your kids play rugby?
I don't think I can. I don't think I can prevent them from doing what they want to do. Right? If they want to play a specific sport, you have to let them do it, and that's something that I've learned with my 10-year-old. He wants to play soccer, you can't stop it. But I tried to get him to tennis. It didn't work. But I think what we can do is really educate them. Although I do tell him not to head the ball, he still does. But just make sure that you're aware of what happens when they do play the sports. Be there for when they do get an impact, and make sure that it's managed appropriately, because that's all you can do. I think sports is very important for kids. You need them to play sports so they can go to bed at 9 o'clock, right?
Exactly.
But and to run around and be physical. And I think it's and we've shown there's a massive study at QBI which has shown how important sports is for neurogenesis and for spatial learning, and how important, so physical activity needs to be done. And I think it has to be done in a way where they enjoy doing it, because I think that maximises the benefit of it. But I think we just have to take precautions around the management of it.
Sorry,
and be aware.
Especially when you're playing team sports. I mean, you learn how to work in, and you got better people in your community. Like, there's no doubt about it. I guarantee you, half these kids that are breaking into houses, they've never played sport in their life, or they're, don't get me started. But I mean, the parents need a clip. But anyway, that's another story. But the whole thing about playing team sports is learning how to work in with different personalities. Like your mate's completely different personality to me, and over the top, and stuff, and you learn how to deal with that, and then you're a better person down the track.
Warwick, what are your thoughts?
I'm not sure I have anything more to say than
we need to stick the MEG helmet on you.
And people, then it's already been said. I think it's always a balance. There's a lot of benefit to physical exercise, and you need to trade that off against the risk of injury. It would be, I think it would be very unwise to suggest you don't do physical exercise. The net benefits are gonna outweigh the risks. But yeah, be mindful of minimising the risks where you can.
You said you didn't have anything to say, but it's actually led perfectly into my next question, so thank you.
You need to ask the clinician, what does he think?
Yeah.
I think Gary started this. Yeah. Would you let your kids play rugby?
So long as they were going onto a pitch that the referee was educated, the opposition was educated, they were educated, people around them were educated around what a concussion is, how to prevent it, how to risk it, they've been coached properly, yes, I would.
Yeah, so similar to
And
your
actually
analogy
encourage
with
them to do
driving.
it. Yeah.
So Trevor, anyone can get a brain injury, but clearly there's significant interest in brain injuries in the sports setting, and much of this is driven by reports of athletes who are suffering long-term neurodegenerative diseases after they retire, and a variety of neurological problems. As someone who's seen multiple generations of footballers come and go, Can you give us some insight into what you and your fellow athletes are concerned about as you navigate life after football?
Yeah, I think we're all, like, when it come out a bit more about what's happening, a few years ago, I think we all had a little bit of a step back and thought, oh, geez, am I susceptible down the track? And one of my best mates, I played footy at the Roosters with, we're roommates for 5 years, and he's got early stages of it, and he's 4 or 5 years younger than me. Brendan Hall, who's a champion bloke, and I only seen him a little while ago, but he's having to deal with that. So he come up and seen me a couple of weeks ago, and like his long-term memory is very good still, but his short-term memory is a bit scatty at the moment. So anyway, but he's but I can never remember him getting a head knock. You know what I mean? So that was baffling to me, because I mean, he was 5'8", number 6, and I think like as forwards, I would have had probably a few more knocks than he would have. And not I don't know that, but I'm just surmising, and like kind of, and I think I'm going okay, but I think obviously it's still. You're saying with the helmets and that, as well. That's fantastic stuff. But I just don't know if you're susceptible to it anyway. From day one, is it in your family, genes, stuff like that as well? So I really, as I said, I'm no rocket science on that type of stuff, but I think it's very baffling sometimes. You know what I mean? Like this, why does someone get that and someone else doesn't, and they've done the same thing? So it's a bit scatty, I think, sometimes.
Well, look, this is such a wonderful panel because you all keep doing my job for me. Fatima, what's the scientific state of our knowledge about the link between repetitive brain trauma and long-term neurodegenerative diseases? So Trevor's obviously said there's anecdotal evidence, we've got a significant amount of epidemiological, public health evidence, but what's the state of scientific knowledge about those links? And I'll bring Gary in after you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the research for longitudinal studies to really show that link is there, right? Nobody's done a study where they followed up children who've been playing sports all their life and children who haven't been playing sports and done an epidemiology study around, what do they have at 40 or 50 or 60? Yeah. We don't have those studies. And I don't think we even, we know that repetitive injuries might affect our brain in some way. To me, just looking at the studies that are out there in the literature, where you'll get people who've played rugby all their life and they've had the head knocks and they've come off the fields, and they're diagnosed with probable to possible CTE. We can't diagnose it ante-mortem really, but have the symptoms of it, versus those who've played all their life, have had concussions, but they're completely fine. And I do think that there is a vulnerability, just like you'll have a vulnerability for Alzheimer's disease. I do think that there's a genetic component. I think there's a lifestyle component to it. So I think there's a lot of confounding factors that we don't measure in our studies because we haven't had the resources to do those longitudinal studies. But if you were to do a study where you really want to understand that link between brain injuries and CTE, you'd have to have all those confounding factors taken into account to be able to say, look, there is a link, or there's a genetic component to it. So, one example was when we went to to Terrace, I think Andrea it was, or Churchy, where we were speaking to the director of rugby, and we said that we're doing this MRI study. We'd like to know whether there's a susceptibility for certain children. He goes, it's just like getting children into sports. Some of them just don't have the physique, and we actually tell them you shouldn't be playing rugby because you don't have the physique to take on the tackling and so. And I wouldn't be surprised at some 10 or 20 years where we come and say, you do have vulnerability for getting long-term consequences, just like there's studies which are showing that you've got vulnerability to getting migraines because there's specific genes for that. I wouldn't be surprised if at one point in time when we do those genetic studies with the data that's available to us to say, some people are more vulnerable. If you get multiple concussions, you are bound to get, neurodegenerative effects compared to others which don't have that vulnerability. But I don't think we know that at the moment.
Yeah, and it's clearly a really complex issue with, as you said, lots of confounding factors
Definitely.
across a life course. Gary, what's your take on this?
Yeah, with any disease, there's modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors, which we've been talking about. I think we know there's modifiable risk factors for any neurodegenerative diseases that, smoking, alcohol, staying physically healthy post-retirement, trying to keep your social interactions, which again, one of the positive aspects of sport. And then there's the non-modifiable. There's gender stuff. There's maybe genetic factors as well. Having repetitive head traumas and not being managed properly once you have repetitive head traumas, there is that risk, I believe. So now we have to do some long-term studies to find out who's at risk and what steps we need to do to help continue to protect players so we can keep them fit and active and healthy and enjoying the things they like to enjoy.
Absolutely. Clearly there's more research that needs to be done. But one of the challenges in research is the funding environment in Australia. And Warwick, I wonder if I can come to you on this. As the director of a major research centre, I think a lot of us don't necessarily understand how research gets funded in Australia. And could you tell us about some of the challenges of research funding and the research funding environment to those of us who aren't professional researchers?
You're causing me pain just thinking about it.
I would never want to do that.
Look, it is a hard process getting research funded, not just in Australia, but around the world. And it's rightfully a hard process because we're asking the taxpayer of our country, of Australia, to support us to do something we're interested in. So it's a privilege of being an academic that you get to decide in some sense what you do and be driven by curiosity, right? So, yeah, we always have to be mindful that of where the money is coming from. But it is a major process to get anything to get research funded. For example, the centre that I have the privilege to lead was a 1,000-page application that caused many of my hairs to go grey. That was for a substantial amount of money, so we got $35 million over 7 years from the Australian Research Council. But it was a very large amount of time and effort. There are studies that show that for many research funding schemes, and in fact the amount of time that all of the people who apply for that funding put in amounts to more money than the amount that the scheme awards. So there are challenges, but I do think those challenges are actually broadly positive. That's not positive. If you have schemes that waste more research resources in applying than give out, that's clearly not a good scheme. But being forced to ask the question, what research should I be doing? Why is it significant and why is it impactful for the community that's funding me is really important. So broadly, I think the scheme is, that the system is good. I'm a researcher. I always think that we could put more money into research. I think it broadly helps society over the long term. It's one of the main things that leads us to advance as humanity. Yeah.
I think we put a lot of money into research. Sorry, there's always going to be more money going into research, but we need patients and study people to be part of research.
Sure.
I work in a public hospital where AFL, NRL, rugby union say if you've suffered concussion, go and see medical help. We see a lot of patients come to emergency departments and non-sports related concussions come there. I'll give one example. We tried to recruit for one study. We had 100 patients who arrived with concussion to our emergency department. One agreed to participate in the study because they thought it's going to take a lot of time out of their life to get their phone calls, go for one MRI post. So Fatima and I can talk to this a lot that we could see 200 patients a month come into my emergency department, and we'd be lucky to get 1 to 2% actually want to participate. So I think we need a lot more of that public knowledge around that, and a lot more of the great. We pour money into it, but unless we've got people actually willing to participate in it, there's no point.
And we've got a question on the screen here that's, I think, hitting on this really nicely, is if you could wave a magic wand for your research teams to solve one of your big problems, what would it be? And so money is obviously very important, but clearly research participants and their willingness to be involved in research is obviously vital too.
I think that would be it. Is you're signing up to these sports and you're putting yourself potentially at risk. Well, let's understand that risk and let's say that you're going to be. Once you sign up to play, you're actually signing up to be part of the research. So yes, there's invasive stuff, and ethic committees have to get involved if we're going to stick needles in people or stuff like that. But otherwise, I think we should all be part of it. If we're going to play these sports and want to continue to make it safer, and you go to the hospital after suffering a concussion or a traumatic brain injury, I think it should be fair to say that you should be willing to participate in some research to improve it.
I also think it's been very, very challenging, specifically in the concussion and mild brain injury space, because, with our studies where we do moderate to severe brain injury, the patient knows that they're not doing well, they want to do the research. You find that the uptake into those studies is much, much higher. Everybody wants to sign up to the study pretty much. You go to a hospital and you've done the numbers and you get, 1,000 patients a week, yet you get no patients to sign up because they can walk through the door and they feel they're okay. But it might be the case, one of them might come back the next week with, concussive symptoms. And I just think that this is what's really prohibiting any advances in this field in concussion, because it's just invisible, the effects that it's having on the brain, and we're not getting people to test for it.
Yeah, and look, Trevor, as an athlete, this has helped the participation in research projects like this is helping to make the game safer. So it's an act of sort of community solidarity in a way.
I was just saying when you said that, should be putting pressure on the NRL and the Rugby Australia to do this. So I mean, if it's for the benefit for the players and the future players as well, they should do it with open arms, shouldn't they?
I would hope so.
Yeah, a lot of the unions are happy to participate. It's you go through the ethical considerations and then you go to the consent aspect, and it's actually usually the players that are saying, "Oh, I just can't be bothered with doing these tests and turning up for follow-up." In the amateur arena especially, is I'm not going to take half a day off and go get an MRI done and follow-up blood tests.
I remember when I was with the Titans, I was doing the coaching staff down there, and they were doing blood tests on players through bone density and all that type of stuff as well. And so I mean, if it's, I think, again, take it out of their hands.
I must say that with the tackle study, and Teresa would know more than I would because she's on the ground there with the parents, it really is the parents who want to make a difference and for the greater good that, convince their children to be part of the study. And I think it's important because at this adolescent stage, we're able to follow up these participants and we're able to, follow them up longitudinally because they are in Queensland, and even if they're not, it's not hard to do questionnaires over the phone. But I think the parents have been our driver for getting students into the study. You go home and you talk to your son, even if he's not really wanting to do an MRI, and sort of say, it might be good for you. One of the benefits that we've had is that, parents have been able to go back to scans with Q-Scan a year before to say, we'd like to see the MRI scan that this student has done a year back because they've just had a concussion now. And I think there's benefits to having that longitudinal data in the system, which you can go back to say, how is he progressing? So, I think a huge thanks to the parents, to the families that have, enrolled their students in studies like this, because I think that's what makes the difference in us collecting this knowledge.
The professional arena is actually like the instrumental mouth guards. The players have to wear them, and if they don't wear them, then they're not allowed to participate in the head injury assessment process. So if they have a possible, they're off. They can't actually get the assessment.
Sure.
And in the last few seasons, we've done some vestibular ocular assessments that, as part of research, that every player had to sign up to participate in. So it's actually easier in the professional arena. It's harder at the grassroots with the volume.
Yeah, I suppose that relationship between the sporting organisations and the athletes as being employees rather than people who voluntarily signed up to play recreational football changes that environment or changes that relationship, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You'd struggle to get it happening in the bush and stuff like that, though, wouldn't you? I mean, and Australia's a big place, and there's a lot of people, AFL, rugby league, rugby union, all through the country, you know what I mean, and a lot of them are country areas, so there's a lot of participants in those areas that probably can't participate in those deals and that as well.
Yeah, it's a really important point about we've focused for quite a while in concussion studies on that elite men's sports space, and we have, because of lack of resources or any other range of factors, sort of foregone research into bush football, into recreational football. But I think one of the other spaces that we've waylaid is women's football, and there's a huge increase in the number of women who are playing Australian rules football, who are playing rugby league, rugby union, and a range of other contact sports. What are we missing from the women's sports space in terms of research and knowledge? And I'll go to Fatima and then Gary.
I think it's numbers, first of all, but I also think the studies show that there is a difference. It's not like, women just playing, I guess, trying to get sympathy for that. The studies have shown that women are more susceptible to the impact of a concussion. Maybe it's the neck muscles or it's other aspects of the brain that we don't know. We've been trying to get some tackle participants from schools where they have, female rugby teams. It's just not the same as the male rugby teams. But we're hoping that this is something that we can study as part of our work, because we do know that there are biological differences, and that's what the research has been showing so far. I don't know how you would manage that, and that's probably back to Gary. But there definitely are differences in terms of biology with the outcomes.
Yeah, we're starting to understand that the female athlete is at risk of other injuries, even outside of concussions, ACL injuries, etc., with the biological and hormonal imbalances. There's a lot of prevention strategies going into that to recognise that and how to manage that. Rugby union probably only puts in the last 2 to 3 years the first professional contracts for women. So there's a lot. We're lacking massive data and understanding in it. The Women's World Cup is just about to kick off in England at the minute in rugby union, and every woman participating again has an instrument and mouthguard in place. There's the HIA process, and there's going to be a lot of screening and research done during that time as well.
Yeah, and the resourcing gap's really interesting there as well, because we've got this new generations of women who are coming through and they're playing elite contact sport, and the expectation to play at this elite level, to play as professionals, but often without the same resources and support from the major organisations. So if you're a professional male athlete who gets a concussion on a Saturday, and then you've got this structure that's built around you to support you, but we know a lot of professional female athletes have to go to work, have to go to uni on a Monday, and may not be able to afford to have that time off.
Well, at the Super W level, so Super Professional Rugby Union level, there is now a full match day team that is there to support the team doctor. So it is catching up, and there is the resources that you have at the men's professional level is now being resourced at the women's professional level. So, but that's taken, it's only really the last 12 months that's come in place.
Yeah, but that was us 20, 30 years ago. That was the blokes who were doing that as well, 30 years ago. So, I mean, you work all day and then you go to training and stuff like that, and there wasn't many working, like Wally probably wasn't working, but like I had an apprenticeship and stuff like that as well, so you had to earn a living those days too, in the early days. And but I know the professionalism these days with the players, and there's no excuse, for not being on top of everything, because they're there at least 6 days a week. Especially pre-season, they're actually 7 days a week. So all this stuff with the studies and that you want to do, I just can't believe that they don't want to do it. If they should be doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about learning lessons from the past as well. Is if we're going to do this research and we're going to implement these policies, we need to make sure this is done in an ethical and an inclusive way, that we bring everyone along with us.
Yeah, for sure.
Trevor, I'll stay with you. You've talked about how football's changed over the last 4 decades. Despite everything that we know about the potential risks of brain injury in sport, what makes contact sport still worth playing?
I just loved it from the day one when I was a kid. Playing in the backyard with my brother, as I said, early days, and then we just grew up playing it and just loved it. And we played all footy codes those days because being in Queensland, obviously, it's conducive to the weather and everything. That football's one of our best, biggest sports. So I played AFL as a kid, soccer. Wasn't much good at soccer anyway, but mums all put boys into soccer because they think it's safer and stuff like that, which is a load of crap. But anyway, because you're doing ankles and knees and that a lot more than you do league that I did. But I think the footy codes and stuff has been fantastic for me as a person. All my contacts in life have been through football. 90% of it's been through football, and obviously it's helped me out enormously in my life. So I wouldn't regret a moment, playing footy. So I'll do it all over again. Shit, yeah.
Thanks, Trevor. Fatima and then Gary and Warwick, I'll come to you. What strategies, as researchers and as scholars, what strategies have you seen implemented in contact sport recently or over time that give you confidence that these games are safe to play?
And I think the clubs and are doing their best with what information they have available, right? If you're putting in a 19-day rule out, no going back to play, just to take that preventative measure, that's what they've got to work with. They don't have the diagnostics, they don't have the data that allows them to take other measures. They're being quite precautious. I do think starting with the research that the clubs are doing, for example, and allowing research to take place is a very positive step, because it's the only way we're going to understand, right? You need to link what's happening on the field to, impacts of concussion down the track, and be able to fold back to sort of say, yes, this is what's causing an impact on the field, and this is what's causing the longer term consequences, so this is where we need to stop. And I think allowing that research to take place is a very, very positive step forward. There was a question there about the HIA and whether it's reliable. And while it's the only thing that we've got to work with, I think research like the tackle study is something which can allow the MRI and the biomarkers to inform whether the HIA is right or not, and how much subjectivity the HIA has. Although it's subjective, how much is it, reliable and sensitive and specific to the policies that are on the field? So I do think, they are working with what we've got. I think we need to do more research to be able to say, this is what's happening on the field, and this is how it's showing up longer term, and this is what we need to do back at the early phase to make that difference happen.
And obviously your study, the tackle study, is obviously vital in this, but there needs to be more research across the country and in different settings as well to solidify this understanding. Definitely.
I think the government recently put, some amount of funding into raising awareness with the pre-budget submission, to raise awareness across all schools around the nation, really, to inform students of the issues of concussion and what's happening. But I do think that, it's while you're raising awareness, it's very hard to measure that impact. You do need to collect the data to say, how has it been preventative? How has it made a difference? How has this intervention made a difference? And I think that's what's important.
More participants in the tackle study, maybe.
Oh, we need more participants. I know there was a question here about why swimming included. Normally when we do research, we need to have a control. So, while we're collecting samples from students who play rugby or who play basketball, there's a lot of movement, there might be, concussions, subconcussive injuries. We know that swimming is one of those which requires that physical exercise and the intensity, but it doesn't necessarily involve the concussion. So you need to factor in how much is the physical exercise contributing to those changes that you see in physiological markers. And this is why we've got swimming as one of those, because it's probably the safest in terms of that, but picking up on that physical change.
I was curious about that too, actually.
Yeah, that's why.
Gary, from a rugby perspective, what are the policies or changes that you've seen in the game that you use the driving analogy with rules and safeguards in place? What are some of those rules and safeguards that you've seen in the rugby context that give you confidence that it's a safe game to play?
Yeah, I think chatted about some of the initiatives from, the instrument mouth guards, the blue card system, the education packages and procedures that we do now, and courses that doctors, physios, sports trainers must do in order to work, even at club level. They must do online courses and face-to-face courses, which we travel around Australia teaching on. So there's a lot of stuff, energy going into that education piece and understanding it. Then at the professional level, it's actually echoing what Gilly said. You have to sometimes worry it's not going too far. You turn up to a test match, and there's a match day medical team, which obviously is there for serious injuries, neck injuries, broken legs, etc. as well. But there's people working the 12 screens. There's doctors sitting in the stands looking for concussions. They're all radioed up to each other. There's probably about 4 to 5 people who are there specifically to watch and back play for any potential concussion, who then will get fed down to me as a team doctor to go and assess someone on the pitch. But we've got to work with these teams and with each other in a, we've got to trust each other, and then the players will trust us as well. That we're not going to pull them off for every impact, because it's competitive sport, there's contact, and actually we're going to be pulling them off when there's actually a true concern. And we're just probably on that line at the minute where we don't want to go too far, but we've got to continue to work with the players to have that trust in us that we are removing them for specific reasons.
Warwick, what gives you confidence about the safety of contact sport?
I don't know if I can really answer that question, to be honest. I think the other panelists are much more expert, and maybe I'll leave it to them.
I just I watch all sports, and I love watching all. I'm a glutton for punishment, but UFC is one of the most. It's gone through the roof. You know what I mean? Like television-wise, and participants as well. I've got mates that do it. A bit younger than me, but yeah, I think UFC as well, like that, like you don't get more combative sport than UFC, you know what I mean? So, I don't know what the rules and the regulations are there, but in boxing, I did a little bit when I was a young fella, and if you got knocked or you had a fairly significant, clip to the head, you're out for 3 months. So, but UFC, I see blokes just snoring before they hit the ground. So I just think, oh, geez, that's, that can't be good. You know what I mean?
And we talked about this over coffee about 2 weeks ago, but clearly there is an appetite for that level of contact and violence.
Yeah, well, the money's gone through the roof for these sports, and obviously they're watching it on TV because the numbers are going through the roof. You know what I mean? So people want to see blood and guts. That's just the way it is. That's what we like. It goes back to the old Roman days, doesn't it? You know what I mean? So if you do like rugby league, rugby union, AFL, if it all stopped tomorrow, it'll be what do they call it? In the back blocks and behind in dungeons and the old days there was boxing. You know what I mean? That's how they fought, those days as well. So yeah, it's interesting to see how we've changed a bit. Not saying we should go back to those days, but that's some people should, but
Some of us are still there. Folks, it's been absolutely wonderful seeing your questions come through on the Slido screen, and we've been able to ask a lot of those questions as we've gone through tonight. We're going to wrap it up now, because I'd like to get you to drinks and canapes a couple of minutes early. Can we each give our panellists a round of applause, please? And folks, keep that round of applause going for the questions you've asked, because they've been wonderful. And thank you for being here.